We've been involved in a very important topic, one that I believe all members of the church need to study, and I appreciate the fact that you're interested and that you're willing to be here for this study. Last week we were talking about the values of human suffering. There are a number of values in it, and one of the goals that I have for this quarter is to motivate us to look at the other side of it. Usually we think about the suffering and the negative things, the bad part of it, but I like for us to think about the positives, the lessons that we can learn from it, and the things that it can and will do for us. Near the end of the class last week, I was trying to contrast the suffering that we experience with the blessings of heaven. It is my conviction that we need to keep our eyes on heaven and the blessings that we shall enjoy there. And if we'll do that, it'll make these things on earth not seem so bad. Near the end of the class last week, Tana told us that her mother's favorite song was "Heaven Will Surely Be Worth It All." Now, that's a beautiful song and a beautiful thought. And I believe that we ought to do more singing about heaven. We need to sing about it regularly and keep it ever before our eyes. Those of us who preach and teach need to preach on it and teach on it. And those who lead singing, I believe, need to lead songs regularly that point us toward heaven. If we can keep our eyes on that life and not so much on this life, then these things on earth won't seem so bad to us. But if we are wedded to this world and we are mainly concerned about this life, then these storms of life can blow us away if we're not careful. So I believe that we need to sing about it, think about it, day after day, week after week. Now, in view of the things that we've been studying, and we've been trying to give some answers as to why people suffer, and in view of the things that have been presented, we'd like to ask tonight, why do people suffer? And you say, well, that's what we've been talking about, isn't it? And it is. But I'd like for this to be a summary of some principles that we have set forth and some arguments that we have set forth that help us to understand why there is suffering in the world. And I'd like for it to be a lesson in which we can sort of put these things into practice in our lives. We'd like for it to be an application of the things that we have been studying about. And so I said last week that there are some who have missed some of the lessons. And these lessons are cumulative and they are built upon those that go before it. And if we miss one or two in there, the chain will be broken. And we'll miss some things that are vital to our understanding of the total subject. And so from time to time, I may want to summarize some things that we've talked about. I want to do that tonight and perhaps give a little different slant on some things. But we'd like for us to think about why we suffer. Yes, sir.
I'd like to remind everyone that if they didn't know the lesson, that Ron is posting them on YouTube, and so they can go online and watch it. And I would encourage everybody, if they missed the one, to do that. If they're uncertain how to get to it, see Ron, or I could probably help them too. But it's available to be seen or listened to.
I appreciate that advertisement for that. It might be helpful to those who have missed some. And I believe it would be helpful if you would go back and listen to those, because it'll tie some things together. I'd like to suggest some reasons why we suffer tonight. And some of you have heard some of these things, but we'll perhaps give a little different slant to some of it. Number one, we may suffer because of our own sins. We've tried to indicate this. Sometimes we suffer because of things we do. In Galatians chapter 6, verses 7 and 8, Paul said, "Be not deceived." And he goes on to tell us that whosoever will sow to the flesh shall reap of the flesh. Whoever sows to the Spirit shall of the Spirit reap life everlasting. So it depends upon what you sow. If you sow to the flesh, you'll reap of the flesh. If you sow to the Spirit, you'll reap of the Spirit. And sometimes we suffer because we have sown to the flesh. And when we do that, sometimes we want to blame God with our suffering. One of the things that we've talked about is the fact that many people want to blame God when they suffer. And sometimes they are suffering because of their own actions. Now, it isn't really sensible to blame God for our suffering when we bring it on ourselves. It doesn't make good coming in out of the rain sense to say God is responsible for it when we are suffering because we have sinned. I read a little ditty about a little girl about 7 years of age who had a little brother about 5 years of age. And the little girl said, "Mama, whip Billy." And Mama said, "Why? What did Billy do?" And the little girl said, "He broke my doll." She said, "How did Billy break your doll?" She said, "When I hit him over the head with it, it broke his leg off of it." Now that's a childish thing, but isn't that about the way many people handle it? They do things that are wrong, they bring suffering upon themselves, and then they blame God with it. But God's not responsible for it. I ran across a little article that I clipped and put in my files apparently many years ago. I think it came from the Christian Chronicle, and it is more to the point here. Listen to this. A minister and an atheistic barber were once walking through the city slums. "This is why I cannot believe in a God of love. If God was as kind as you say, He would not permit all this poverty, disease, and squalor. He would not allow those poor bums to be addicted to dope and other character-destroying habits. No, I cannot believe in a God who permits these things." The preacher was silent until they met a man who was especially unkempt and filthy. His hair was hanging down his neck, and he had a half-inch stubble on his face. And the minister said to the atheistic barber, "You can't be a very good barber, or you wouldn't permit a man like that to continue living in this neighborhood without a haircut or a shave." And indignantly the barber answered, "Why blame me for that man's condition? I can't help it that he's like that. He has never given me a chance to help him. If he would only come to my shop, I could fix him up and make him look like a gentleman." And then the preacher gave that atheistic barber a penetrating look and said, "Then don't you blame God for allowing these people to continue in their evil ways, when He is constantly inviting them to come to Him to be saved and changed. The reason these people are slaves to sin and evil habits is because they refuse the one who died to save and deliver them." And the barber saw the point. Do you? Now that barber couldn't be blamed because those people were dirty and filthy and had not had a haircut or a shave. They just looked filthy because they haven't come to him to help them. And the same reason is true of those people who were hooked on drugs and prostitutes, drug addicts, and that type of thing. They're like that because they haven't come to Christ to help them. And Christ invites them to come constantly. He said, "Come unto me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn of me, for I am meek and lowly in heart, and ye shall find rest unto your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." Now, Jesus invites all of these people, no matter what their condition, to come to Him. And if they won't come to Him, how can anyone blame Christ with those things? How can they blame God for their suffering? And so sometimes we suffer because of our own sins, and then sometimes we blame God for it. Even after we repent, sometimes there is suffering. A person may have cirrhosis of the liver because he's been drinking alcohol. He may come to himself. He may repent. He may be forgiven. He may have the hope of going to heaven, but he still has cirrhosis of the liver. the fact that he has come back to the Lord and has repented doesn't change the cirrhosis of the liver. Now, there are those who get involved in things and don't know what they're doing, and they do things that they later regret, but they have to reap what they sow. Sometimes they suffer later because of things that they've done like that. Then there's a question of AIDS. There are people who have AIDS, and generally speaking, AIDS comes to a person because of immorality, generally sexual immorality with those of the same sex. Sometimes it happens because they're using a dirty needle in the use of drugs, illegal drugs, but they contact AIDS. Now, they might come to themselves, they might repent, they might be forgiven, they might have the hope of going to heaven when they die, but they still have AIDS. They can still die. I remember a day when a man in the congregation where I was preaching came into the office, and he sat down, we said just a word or two, and he just went right into it. He said, "My son is a homosexual, and he has AIDS, and he's dying, and he's on his last leg, and I would like to arrange for a funeral for him." He wanted me to speak at his funeral. Now, when I went to see that boy, and I didn't know him before, he had been living away from home most of the time, and when he was dying, he came home. And when I met him, I don't even know that he was awake enough to know I was there. Couldn't do much to help him. And he died. I don't know if he repented of his sins when he could. I don't know if he was forgiven. But whether he did or not, he was dying and died. I remember another case. There was a lady in the congregation, and then she had a son in the congregation. Then she had another son who was away from home, but he came home to die with AIDS. I went to see him in the hospital and talked to him about his soul and tried to encourage him to make things right and truly repent. I don't know if he truly repented. That's not in my realm of knowledge. I can't know. But he died, and I spoke at his funeral. And so you can see cases like that and know that a person has sinned in most cases, and he's brought suffering upon himself. And in many cases, they go ahead and die because of that. One of the reasons people suffer is the fact that they have sinned. They've sown wild oats. There's lung cancer. There are people who have smoked until they develop lung cancer or emphysema or some other malady in the body caused by smoking. I pointed out the fact that the Center for Disease Control in Atlanta tells us that nearly 500,000 people die every year because of smoking. Now, when they do that and they develop lung cancer or emphysema, they usually go ahead and die because of it. And so it's possible for people to suffer because they have sinned. Now, there are other ways in which people can sin and bring suffering upon themselves. But I think that is sufficient for us to realize that we can suffer because of our own sins. And thus we need to be very careful and not get into sin and bring those disastrous consequences upon ourselves. Now, there are many things that we need to learn in life, and one of them is this law of nature that you reap what you sow. That's true whether you sow watermelon seed or sin. We reap what we sow. Now, we may suffer for other reasons, and one of the reasons is because of the sins of others. Other people may do things to hurt us and bring suffering to us. As we were coming along through our studies as to the reasons for suffering being in the world, I pointed out the fact that God has given to us the power of choice. And sometimes other people make the wrong choice. They can hurt us because of their choice. In Matthew 18, verses 15 through 17, Jesus gives some teaching about what we're to do when someone sins against us. And I believe that Jesus is talking about those who are God's people in that passage. And he's talking about personal sins, when someone sins against us personally. Let me paraphrase what Jesus said on that occasion, and you'll remember it. He said, "Moreover, if thy brother sin against thee, or trespass against thee," in the King James, "go to him and tell him his fault between thee and him alone. And if he hears thee, thou hast gained thy brother. If he will not hear thee, take with you one or two more, that at the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses every word may be established. And if he hear them, you've gained your brother. If he does not hear thee, if he neglects to hear thee, tell it unto the church. And if he neglect to hear the church, let him be unto thee as a heathen and a publican." Now, it wouldn't do much good for us to tell it to the church if a person's outside the church. I don't believe it's talking about those folks. It's talking about those who are God's people. That's my conviction on the matter. But Jesus is teaching us that other people can sin against us in the church, and we ought to go to them and see if we can make it right. We may suffer because of their sins. We do not suffer the consequences of their sin. That is the guilt of it. We can suffer because they have sinned against us, but they'll have to suffer the consequences of the guilt of their sin. In Ezekiel 18 and verse 20, you remember that the passage says, "The soul that sinneth, it shall die. The son shall not bear the iniquity of the father, neither shall the father bear the iniquity of the son." That simply means we're responsible for our own sins. Fathers are, and sons are, children are. And if someone else sins against us, we may suffer the pain of him hurting us in some way, but we do not suffer the guilt of his sins. And sometimes we suffer because of the sins of others. And then we may suffer because of natural disasters. We've talked about that. Hurricanes, tornadoes, earthquakes, things of that nature can hurt us. There's one thing certain. Christians are subject to the same laws of nature that non-Christians are subject to. We receive the same blessings when we obey the laws, and we receive the same punishment if we violate those laws. You remember that Jesus said in Matthew 5 and verse 45, "For he maketh his sun to rise on the evil and on the good, and sendeth rain on the just and the unjust." So you see, the sun and the rain can be blessings, or they can hurt people. And it comes upon good and bad. God's people can suffer when they violate these laws that run the world, just as non-Christians can. Now, we noted that in Genesis 3, man disobeyed God in eating the forbidden fruit, and because of that sin, suffering came into the world. Genesis 3, verse 18, also shows that a curse was placed upon the earth, not just man and woman, but upon the earth. "Cursed is the ground for thy sake," the text says. God placed the curse upon man. He'd have to die, and he would suffer. And because of the curse upon the ground, it would bring forth thorns and thistles, and man would have to earn his bread by the sweat of his brow. Woman had a curse placed upon her. She would have to die. She would have to bear children in pain. And she would suffer in various ways as well. One of them is she's to be in subjection unto the man. And so people can suffer when these natural laws are violated. We can bring suffering upon ourselves sometimes when we don't realize that we're doing that. So we need to be aware of God's laws, the laws of the universe, and not violate them. And in connection with that, we must suffer because we're in a world of law and order. God placed these laws in effect, and everything is to work according to the law of law and order. And if man violates those laws, he can suffer for it. For example, there's the law of gravity. We've talked about that, but I think we need to say it again. There are those who feel that they can disobey the law of God and not suffer for it. A person may say, I'm going to break the law of gravity. So he climbs up on a 50-story building, and he says, I'm going to jump off and I'm going to break the law of gravity. And so he jumps off. Which way does he go, up or down when he jumps off? The law of gravity says he's going to come down. About halfway down, he may say, well, so far so good. But then when they scrape him up off the sidewalk down there, he has merely proven the law. It works. And he has not broken the law. He has violated the law. And so we may suffer when we violate these laws that govern our world. Or take the automobile. A person drives an automobile, and he may be driving 70 miles an hour and run off the road, and he may run into a big oak tree about this big around. Well, when he does, that car is going to stop. That tree is not going to move at all. He runs into the tree, and that thing is crushed against that tree. Now, if you're riding in that car and you're not buckled down, according to the law of physics, you're not going to stop. You're going to go forward, and you'll be crushed in that thing. And even if you have a seatbelt on, when you're driving that fast and hit a tree, that thing is going to crush you as well. The front of that automobile is going to be pushed right into your lap. And so a person has violated the law of God, and as a result, he suffers for it. And so there are many laws that govern our world that can bring suffering to us if we violate those laws. And Christians are subject to those laws just as everyone else is. And when a man is a Christian and he violates one of those laws, he can just expect to suffer for it. And God is not going to set aside these laws to keep the Christian in good health, you see. If the Christian jumps off that 50-story building, he's going to suffer just like a person who's not a Christian. And so the violation of the laws of God can oftentimes cause us to suffer. Now, take this game that many people play. Ted, what's the name of that school up at Tuscaloosa that plays with that little old funny-shaped ball? Alabama, that's it. Suppose they're playing against this school over here next to Opelika. And the Alabama wide receiver, he catches the ball, and he's running down the sideline toward the other end. And he's right next to the sideline. He's tiptoeing down the sideline, trying to keep in bounds. And suppose a player from the opposing team runs over to try to knock him out of bounds or tackle him. Can that player move the boundary line over there 4 feet or 5 feet so he won't run out of bounds? You couldn't have a game of football if you can just change the rules like that if you want to. Now, if a human being goes up on top of a 50-story building and jumps off, he can't expect God to change the rules because he has done that foolishly, you see. And so we must understand God has these laws that govern the universe and laws that govern the world, and they are for our good. We couldn't live here without them. But if we violate them, we'll suffer for it. We may also suffer because of ignorance. Sometimes we do things because we don't know certain things. I'm convinced that there were many people many years ago who began to smoke when they did not realize the dangers involved in it. Probably many of us have had kinfolks who began to smoke back there in the 30s or 40s when they didn't know the dangers of it. And as a result, they contracted cancer of the lungs or emphysema, and they died because of it, because of ignorance. They didn't know the law or the rule. And then there is the matter of drinking. There are those who drink and develop cirrhosis of the liver, and because of ignorance, they may suffer and die. Sadly, that's true also among some who are members of the church. Now, I'd like to say again that I believe the Bible teaches that Christians have no business drinking alcohol. It's a poison, and it will destroy one's life if he's not careful about the matter. Now, I know there are some members of the church who don't know what the Bible teaches about it. And I know preachers who don't know what the Bible teaches about it. But I can ask one question, and I can tell you if you've studied the matter carefully. One question. That question is, tell me the meaning of the word wine in the Bible. And if that person says, it's an alcoholic drink, I say, you haven't studied it. You don't know. In some cases, it refers to an alcoholic drink, but in some cases, it does not. It refers to pure grape juice. Read Isaiah 65, verse 8. It talks about wine in the cluster, still in the grape, still in the cluster, on the vine. That's not alcohol. That's just pure grape juice. And if a person assumes that the word wine always means alcohol, he's going to misunderstand the Bible. And so he may think it's all right for him to drink because there are verses, such as a preacher told me on one occasion. The thing that bothers me is that there are passages in which wine is not condemned. That is true. But he doesn't understand that in those cases, it's just pure grape juice it's talking about. It's not talking about alcohol. But those passages in which it is condemned is talking about alcohol as a drink. And so some people don't understand that. I was talking with a preacher about this matter, and he said, a thing that bothers me is this qualification for the deacons not given to much wine. And he thought that meant it'd be all right to drink some. Let me give you a passage for you to go home and read, meditate upon it. Ecclesiastes 7, verse 17, where Solomon said, be not overmuch wicked. Now let that sink in. Be not overmuch wicked. According to that preacher's method of determining what it means, it'd be all right to be some wicked, just don't be overmuch wicked. And so sometimes people don't know, they just don't understand the teaching of the Bible, and they think it's all right to do things like that, and it brings them suffering. Well, we may suffer because of ignorance. We may also suffer because of carelessness. Sometimes we are careless, and as a result we suffer. Suppose a person is driving and he's trying to text at the same time. And I'm convinced that before long we're going to have more people killed because of texting than because of drinking alcohol. A person can be careless and have a wreck and kill somebody or kill himself. A person may be careless in other ways. I was preaching for a large congregation in the state of Alabama, and we had a couple there who wanted to get married, and they talked to me about performing the ceremony. We did. They got married. And after a period of time, not too long really, that young man dove into a swimming pool on the shallow end, head first, and hit the bottom, broke his neck, and was paralyzed from the neck down. He was pulled out of the water before he drowned, or he never would have made it. He lived, but he was paralyzed from the neck down. He was as helpless as a newborn baby. Someone would have to take care of him the rest of his life. No medicine, no doctor, no surgery could change that. Because of carelessness, he broke his neck. His wife had to take care of him. And she soon saw there'd be no life that way, no real marriage. she couldn't go to work and pay for taking care of him, or she stayed home to take care of him. They'd have no income. So she divorced him, left him because of that tragedy. He suffered in many ways. Suffered physically, suffered emotionally because his wife left him. Carelessness sometimes is responsible for some of our suffering. And so we need to be very careful and not do things that bring suffering to us. We may also suffer because of an unwholesome attitude. Did you know that you can suffer because you got the wrong attitude? We can. Sometimes we do that. We can be miserable and unhappy, and that's suffering, if we have an unwholesome attitude. Now, I have seen that even among members of the church. Sometimes we see members of the church who have a grouchy attitude. I heard about a fellow who was talking to his friend one day, and his friend said, "Do you ever wake up grouchy?" He said, "No, I just let her sleep." Could that be talking about some of us? Could we have that type of attitude? Well, I've seen members of the church who looked like they'd been baptized in vinegar and weaned on a dill pickle. Their attitude is unwholesome, and they're miserable and happy. Let me illustrate it another way. Suppose I told you that I don't like boiled okra. I don't eat boiled okra. I don't like to put anything in my mouth that I can't control. And I can't control boiled okra. I don't want to put something into my mouth if I can't tell if I ate it or dropped it. But now suppose Mackie and I are invited to eat with a couple in this congregation. And so we go for the meal, and they have grilled steak, baked potato, sliced tomatoes, pinto beans, fresh corn, rolls, a good salad, and coconut cream pie like Billy back here makes. And suppose later someone asked me, "Where did you eat yesterday?" And I say, "We ate with brother and sister so-and-so." And this person says, "Well, I know you had a very good meal." I said, "No, I didn't. They also served boiled okra." And so I didn't have a good meal. What would you say about my attitude? You say it's a wrong attitude, an unwholesome attitude. You overlook all those good things and concentrate on that one thing that was not good. That's a wrong attitude. We can suffer sometimes because we have a wrong attitude. Now, attitude is very important. It determines altitude. It determines how far you go. We need to be sure we have a Christian attitude, a positive attitude, a good attitude. I read about a grandma who was invited to come visit with her daughter and family and grandchildren. So she went, and she had a granddaughter about 16 who was taking piano lessons. And the granddaughter said, "Grandma, would you like to make a request for me to play on the piano?" She said, "It doesn't matter what you play, just so it's sad." There are folks with attitudes like that, you see. They're miserable and unhappy because they have an unwholesome attitude. Wouldn't it be good if we had a good, positive Christian attitude? Dan Wheeler. I think Dan used to be a youth director for this congregation in the past. I've known Dan for several years. All the time I was preaching down in Wildwood, Florida, Dan was preaching for the Concord Street Church in Orlando, where I had formerly preached. And I'd been there to preach several times through the years when Dan was there, and I came to know him well. Then Dan moved to Montgomery. Now, Dan has had some hard knocks through the years. Some of you are aware of it. He's had some hard knocks. He's been to the school of hard knocks. But every time you ask him, "How you doing, Dan?" his stock answer is, "I'm blessed." I don't believe I've ever asked that question and have heard him say something else. He always says, I'm blessed. I saw him back during the lectures at Faulkner. Had not seen him for a while. And I saw him one day and asked him, Dan, how are you? He said, I'm blessed. Now, those of us who know the circumstances know that it would be difficult for us to say that if we had been to the school of hard knocks as he has been. Wouldn't it be wonderful if we had that kind of attitude? I've determined that I want to develop that attitude to a greater extent. We need to be able to be positive and optimistic. We'll be happier people. We won't suffer so much if we have a good, positive attitude like that. Two psychiatrists were walking down the hall one day and met, and one of them said, hi. And the other one said, I wonder what he meant by that. There are people who walk around with a chip on their shoulder, waiting for someone to say something or do something to hurt them. You've seen people like that. They're waiting for someone to hurt them. That's a wrong attitude. We need to be sure we have a Christian attitude, and we can avoid some of the problems that people have. Well, we may suffer because of God's disciplinary action. God's disciplinary action. That thing just changed up there. Last week I was talking about that thing, and I never looked at it once. I forgot all about it. I'm glad these guys are up there turning that thing when they need to. But note that because of God's disciplinary action, we may suffer. Now, we've talked about Hebrews chapter 12, verse 6 and following. The passage says, for whom the Lord loveth, he chasteneth, and scourgeth every son whom he receiveth. But if ye endure chastening, God dealeth with you as with sons. For what son is he whom the Father chasteneth not? But if ye be without chastisement, whereof all are partakers, then are ye bastards and not sons. Furthermore, we have had fathers of our flesh which corrected us, and we gave them reverence. Shall we not much rather be in subjection unto the Father of spirits and live? For they verily for a few days chastened us after their own pleasure, but he for our profit, that we might be partakers of his holiness. Now no chastening for the present seemeth to be joyous, but grievous. Nevertheless, afterward it yieldeth the peaceable fruit of righteousness unto them which are exercised thereby. Now all of us understand that when it says no chastening for the present seemeth to be joyous. I never did enjoy a whipping when I was young, but now I'm glad I had that. Later you can see the profit in the thing. God sometimes allows us to suffer for chastisement, sometimes for our good, you see. Sometimes suffering like that can get us pointed in the right direction. Let me mention something here that I had not thought about before. Maybe all of you have. Did you know that Jesus learned obedience by suffering? Hebrews 5, verses 7 and 8. The passage tells us there, though he were a son, yet learned he obedience by the things which he suffered. And being made perfect, he became the author of eternal salvation unto all them that obey him. Jesus learned obedience through suffering. Now, he was perfect, never made a mistake, never sinned at all. But this text says he learned obedience through suffering. Sometimes we can learn obedience through suffering. So we can sometimes suffer because of God's disciplinary action. Well, I intended to get through this section. That fellow's too long-winded, I guess. But do any of you have any thoughts or comments at this point? Anything at all? Now, I have another thing or two I want to say about this area. And then I want to emphasize another word in that statement that's so often made. Why do bad things happen to good people? I'd like for us to talk about that good people part for just a bit the next time. And then we'll move on to some other matters. Good to have all of you with us tonight. We hope you'll come back and be with us.